The job was too good to be true. I understand that now. The message had popped up in my inbox like 1,000 before it. It sat nestled between a buy Viagra online and a congratulations, you've just win a free iPad email. But as I hovered my mouse over it, I found myself intrigued by the tagline. I could usually spot spam messages, even the ones my inbox seems incapable of catching. This one, though, something about it caught my eye. The spelling and grammar were on point, and something about it just screamed attention. I moved my cursor over the box and hovered it over the email. Preparing to break the cardinal rule, I read the title one more time. Mazer Inc. seeking subjects for free at-home testing. I clicked it, and a very official-looking email informed me that I had been randomly selected to take part in a clinical trial. The email detailed the parameters for this test, the time frame for the test, and the payment method for completion of the test. The parameters were basically A. Take the required supplement they sent you with breakfast and dinner. B. Sign on and watch a series of videos every day for 2 hours. They would involve color patterns, pictographs, and several other standard mental tests. And C. You wear the required Mazer Inc. monitor device while I slept so they could monitor my brain activity and the effects of the supplement. For the price they were quoting, it sounded like a great job. I'd have been a fool not to look into it. I looked the company up online first. It's pretty easy to see which companies are scams these days and which are legit. Mazer Inc. was a publicly traded company, and they did a lot of business in pharmaceuticals and healthcare. They had a few squibs in the news about questionable business practices, but who didn't these days? At the end of the day, they looked on the level, so I applied to their email, thinking I'd never hear back from them again. The return email came a few hours later, thanking me for agreeing to the trial and saying they would ship out my initial package and my initial payment the same day. 3 days later, there was a brown cardboard box on my front doorstep from Mazer Inc., the logo stamped prominently across the side of the box. I hadn't expected it so soon, but the extra money was a nice bonus. Most of my work has been from home these days, and the little bit of it that I was getting was barely keeping the lights on and the rent paid. COVID was still making working in an office difficult, and in these troubled times, every little bit helped. I opened the box and found 8 bottles of something called Neuro Boost. They came in standard 120 capsule bottles and looked perfectly normal, just like something you'd buy at CVS. The monitor turned out to be something similar to an Apple Watch. It had a shiny black band and a smart little face that displayed heart rate, blood pressure, and other general health statistics. I slipped it on, but was confused when I didn't see anywhere to charge it. I shrugged, figuring maybe the internal batteries would last a while. There was also a check stapled to a set of instructions telling me how to get onto the Mazer Inc. website so that I could take my daily mandatory testing. For the amount they were paying, it seemed like a pretty sweet deal if all I had to do was watch a few videos and take some pills and watch the movies for 2 hours a day. When I got up the next morning, there was a bright display on the front of the watch reminding me to take my pills and do my training. So I got up and made some breakfast, took my pills, and got ready for my day. The pills were oily and gave me some fairly rancid burps, but they weren't too bad. When the watch reminded me at noon that I needed to take my training for the day, I sat down at my computer and got to it. The videos were mostly a series of color patterns, flashing in quick succession, as well as a series of brain games that had me doing math or solving puzzles. I guess the pills were supposed to boost my cognitive functions, and I wanted to see if it had affected my scores on the games as badly as the text did. If it did, I couldn't tell. And after my mandatory 2 hours, I closed it up and opened my work folder to see if there was anything new from the office. For the next couple of weeks, everything was fine. I took my pills twice a day, did my mandatory testing, and wore my armband religiously. I found that I liked having it on after a while. It was very comfortable, and being able to glance down and look at my vitals was kind of nice. I've never really had the money for fancy tech, so having something that sort of looked like fancy tech was nice. At the time, I would have told you everything was fine for about the first 2 weeks. But after a few days, I began to notice some strange things around my apartment. It was subtle stuff at first. Things moved, items missing that reappeared a few days later, but it was something more subtle than that as well. Sometimes it felt like someone else had been in my apartment, but that was crazy. The chain was always on, the door was always locked, and, at least to my knowledge, I was the only one that had been in my house since about a week before the quarantine. I thought at the time that I was just being neurotic. But now that I look back on it, I'm pretty sure there was more to it than I was picking up on. The first real sign came to me while I was watching the color patterns one day. I'd been taking the pills for about 2 weeks when one day I watched the colors go from quick flashes of green and blue and yellow and saw a picture. It was just for a second, nothing really substantial, but it looked like a street. It wasn't a street that I knew, and it looked as though it had been torn up by something. I didn't get a good look at it. It was only a flash for a second, but I had to double take to see if I had actually seen what I'd seen. I kept a closer eye on them from then on, but I didn't see anything else that day. The program moved on to math problems a few seconds later, but I never quite forgot about that picture for the rest of the day. That's probably why I remembered it later. I was scrolling through Facebook later, just getting ready to drop off, kind of checking it over without really reading anything, when a friend's post jumped out at me. He was ex-military and he was talking about an attack in Kabul that day, talking about how the military needed to do more or something, when the same street appeared in his picture. It had been the site of a bombing, and the street was destroyed, just as I'd seen it earlier. I sat dry-mouthed for a minute, just mulling it over in my head. The longer I did, the more I kind of began to make excuses for it. It was very strange, but I eventually chalked it up to similarities. I hadn't actually seen that particular street. I was just seeing it now and associating it with what I'd seen earlier. There was no way I had seen the site of an attack before it had even happened. It just wasn't the sort of thing that normal people did. I turned my phone off and rolled over, going to sleep as I told myself it had never come up again. The next day, however, I woke up and found that my shoes were missing. It wasn't like they were expensive or anything, just a pair of Walmart New Balances, but it was the fact that they were missing that confused me. I'd set them beside the door 4 days ago when I'd last left the house. There was no reason in the world that they should be gone, but they were. I could still see the mud from the running track on the carpet by the door, the only proof that they'd been there at all. I searched the house, thinking maybe I'd just put them down somewhere and forgotten about it, but they were nowhere to be found. That made me worried, but again, I put it out of my mind. I was just going stir-crazy from the quarantine, that was all. I just needed to get out more. I'd been taking the pills for about a month when I started seeing more pictures. It happened suddenly. 1 minute I was seeing red and yellow and blue and purple go by, and the next second they were solidifying into pictures. A Walmart somewhere, a Jeep out in the desert, a shoe left on a beach, a bunch of sunflowers, on and on and on. The colors were gone. I never saw them again. From then on, it was just random pictures. I called the number on the back of the bottle after reading it over to see if there were any side effects. After finding the helpline, the one that says to call if you have any adverse reactions, I waited for the robot call to cease and for a person to pick up. To my surprise, someone picked up right away, and I was spared the indignity of wading through the muck. The lady in customer service listened to what I had to say, took down my employee ID, and told me that this was completely normal. She told me that lots of people reported the colors becoming pictures. It was actually very common to get these sort of calls. She said that if it became anything worrisome, to let them know, but seeing the pictures was completely natural. I hung up, feeling a lot better. I kept feeling better until that night. Until I woke up in the middle of my living room with no earthly idea how I'd gotten there. I had my hand wrapped around the doorknob, and I was fully dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. I was wearing a pair of black boots that I didn't recognize, and I had my car keys in my hand. I'd clearly been going somewhere, but I had no memory of deciding to leave. I'd been getting ready for bed the last I remembered, easing under the covers and just getting snug down for the evening. I remembered falling asleep, though I clearly didn't remember waking back up. I sat up for the rest of the night, a cup of coffee in hand to make sure that I didn't try to slip off and sleepwalk somewhere. I had never had a history of sleepwalking, but I'd heard that people could pick it up later in life. Sleep dressing yourself and sleep driving were something I'd never heard of, but I suppose anything was possible. That day I went out and bought a stopper to put under the door. I bought a flipper lock and installed it myself. I would have put a second deadbolt on as well if I hadn't rented the apartment. I thought if I made it more difficult for myself to leave, I might not sleepwalk outside. If I wanted to blunder around my apartment, that was one thing. Going out with no memory of the outside was another, especially if I'd been intending to drive. I had been taking the pills for about 2 months at this point, but I never equated them to what was going on. I think maybe I just didn't want to. I liked the way they made me feel, and I especially liked the extra money I was getting every month for taking them. Some of the pictures I'd been seeing had come up again. The shoe on the beach had turned out to be a little card from a plane crash over Spain. The Walmart had been celebrating its 20-year anniversary when someone had driven a car through the festivities. I had stopped really looking for them anywhere. I didn't really want to know what they were. I had my own problems to worry about. I'd woken up several times since the first night, standing in different rooms and having no clue how I'd gotten there. I woke up in the kitchen, toast burning in the toaster. I shook awake in the shower, fully clothed as the water fell over me. I came to on the floor of my living room with my legs under the couch, and I awoke several times as I fumbled at the lock on my apartment. Whatever was happening to me, my body seemed to be trying to keep me from hurting myself, and for that I was pretty grateful. I think my body knew the pills were doing something strange to me, but my brain was trying its best to justify the actions. It seemed like my brain might be keeping secrets from the rest of us, secrets that I would find out pretty soon. Then one day, I woke up somewhere different. I woke up as I was standing in a factory, preparing to break a tank full of cloudy liquid with a fire axe. I dropped the axe that I'd been preparing to shatter the glass with and looked around in confusion. Where the hell was I? How had I gotten here? I looked around and could see other people causing general destruction as well, but they didn't seem to have come to like I had. They were destroying lab equipment, factory equipment, and anything else they could get their hands on. They were like a group of mindless ants, swarming over everything they couldn't destroy themselves and wrecking it with sheer numbers. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew I had to get the hell out of there. No one came to stop me as I ran, so I took off and didn't stop running till I was outside. Turned out I was actually somewhere I knew. I'd been inside the Terminus Chemical Building. I'd seen the building many times from the freeway, but I'd never actually been inside it. I had a vague idea of what they did, medical research or chemical trials or something, but I couldn't have told you why I'd been there destroying things. I started moving, making my way for the freeway, and when I got there I managed to thumb a ride and get back to the general vicinity of my apartment. It was the middle of the night when I got out of the building, and the sun was just starting to get up when I got home. For the next 3 days I stayed inside and strapped myself into bed every night. I stopped taking the pills and stopped logging onto the website for my daily training. It appeared that I might have lost my monitor while I was busily destroying the factory, but I was honestly glad to have it off me. My phone rang a few times from unlisted phone numbers, but I never picked them up. I was done taking their drugs and being their guinea pig, if that's all I was. On the third day, someone knocked on the door. After a few minutes of peeking through the peephole, I opened it slowly and glanced mousily through the crack. The monitor was on the front mat, sitting like a bomb on the rough fibers. On top was a note, my name written on the back of a folded Polaroid. I reached for it, not wanting it, but needing to see it. The picture was no grainy Polaroid, but a highly detailed photo of me as I smashed a tank of cloudy liquid with the axe I'd swung that night. On the picture was a little caption that read, "Can you see any colors in this picture? Take your pills, do your training, put on your monitor, and get back to work, lest we send this picture to the police and let them know what you've been up to on your nightly excursions."
Michelle huffed angrily as she noticed that her dream catcher had fallen off the ceiling again. She checked under the bed, behind the nightstand, even in the bathroom in case it had rolled inside. Nothing. No dream catcher, no sign of where it had gone. It wasn't as if this was uncommon or anything. Michelle had been replacing dream catchers for most of her life, but the older she got, the more annoying it became. Michelle went to the closet and opened a box labeled Decor, sorting through dozens of dream catchers that she had inside. This just happened sometimes. It had happened since she was young, and she'd gotten used to just replacing them. She picked up a frilly pink one, the leather around the ring dyed to match, but put it back. This one had been a gift, and she didn't want to waste it. She settled on a cheap neon blue one from the gas station and attached it to a hook over her bed. She hated to buy more, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was something that she hadn't experienced since she was very young. Michelle's mother had been fiercely spiritual. Trina Jones had stood out like a sore thumb among the community of strict Baptists and Methodists. Her mother had done a little of this and a little of that to get by, and Michelle had a tumultuous childhood. They lived in a little house that had been owned by her grandmother, and Michelle couldn't remember a time when her grandmother had come to the house for longer than a few minutes. She'd asked her why she never came over once, Michelle spending the night while her mother went to a concert with some friends. She and her grandmother had been shelling peas on the porch of Grandma's house, just on the other side of the block, and her grandmother's scowl had been hard to miss at the time. "I hate to see what your mother's done to that house. It offends my senses, but God forgive me, I won't cast her out. She's free to live her life however she likes, but that doesn't mean I have to let her rub it in my face." Her mother had an odd hodgepodge of beliefs, and Michelle could remember all of them jostling together in the living room of their small house. Trina, though her grandmother had always called her Grace, was an old hippie, and she had been taken with paganism and druidic ideas as she followed her friends on the road before Michelle was born. She had also liked the ideas of Buddhism, Taoism, and several other Eastern spiritualities. As such, the living room was often crowded with altars, statues, and other paraphernalia for whatever ritual or rite her mother was working on. The dream catchers were a part of it. Michelle had always suffered from terrible nightmares, and her mother had hung the dream catchers over her bed since she was very young. Her mother had also noticed the rate at which the dream catchers disappeared, but if she knew why, she never said. To Michelle, it was always just a fun mystery that never seemed to have an answer, like where the socks went when you lost them in the dryer. Michelle hung the new dream catcher over her bed and got back to getting ready for work. She had bills to pay and, inevitably, more dream catchers to buy. She found herself thinking back to the mystery of where all the dream catchers went as her workday slowed down. She tried to puzzle out where they might be disappearing to, but ultimately came up with nothing. As a kid, she had tried everything. She had nailed them to the ceiling. She had set up little nets to catch them if they fell. She had gone so far as to set up a little camera one night to see if someone was taking them. But the recordings had stopped at 11 when it ran out of tape. She hadn't really thought about it in a long time, but the more she pondered it, the more curious she became. She made a mental note to set up her phone camera tonight and see if she could find out what was taking them. The phone wouldn't run out of tape, unlike her video camera, and maybe she could figure out what was going on. 4 nights later, and 3 deleted 8-hour recordings later, Michelle woke up to find her phone knocked over and her neon blue dream catcher missing. The video that she scrolled through that day at lunch was less than helpful. The phone had recorded the dream catcher until about 2 a.m., seeing nothing but the dust motes and the circles of feathers on the strings that hung from the ceiling. Then, at 2:07, Michelle heard a soft sound like a latch being slid, and the window had whispered open. A shadow passed over the camera, which was knocked over a few seconds later. No matter how many times she rewound the footage, Michelle couldn't tell what had knocked the camera over. It recorded nothing else but darkness for the rest of the night, until she had picked it up in the morning and turned it off. That gave her something new to worry about. Who was stealing her dream catchers, and why? Surely it couldn't be the same person all these years. She'd been losing dream catchers since she was 3 years old. She had moved 2 states away from her childhood home and moved into 3 different dorm rooms before settling into this apartment. It couldn't be the same person. But then, who was it? As she sat in traffic that day, she felt moved to call her mother, and as she dialed the number, she felt silly. What did she think her mother was going to do about it? Her mother had been a rolling stone ever since Michelle had left home 3 years ago, and the notion that she'd even be reachable was laughable. Trina had been the big push for her to accept the offer from Tennessee State College. She'd set her daughter down, pulling her away from her studies as she tried not to bomb her final and lose her acceptance letter. She told her that she'd been sent a spiritual vision and that it was time for her to travel, This vision didn't have anything to do with her latest man, Beau, and had everything to do with her wanderlust needing to be satiated. I'll stick around long enough for you to graduate, but after that, I'm hitting the road and giving the keys back to your grandmother. Michelle hadn't talked to her much in those 3 years, but she thought she might have some insight in this. She picked up on the fourth ring, and Michelle could hear soft guitar music and the sounds of laughter in the background. "Hey, sweetie, what's the occasion? I haven't heard from you in months." I need to talk to you about something. I'm a little scared, and it's kind of important." Michelle heard the sound quiet as her mother walked away or stepped into someplace. "What's wrong, Micah? You need a reading or some crystal healing? I can send you some vibrations to the phone if you..." But Michelle cut her off before she could get going. If she let Trina get rolling, they'd be on the phone all night. "I need to know about the dream catchers. Why did they go missing?" There was a long pause, and Michelle was worried that she had lost her. "Mom, are you still hanging them?" she asked. And it wasn't the voice she was used to hearing from her mother. It was low and scared, at odds with her mother's usual gregarious nature. "Of course, but I've been thinking a lot about them lately, and I just..." "Don't stop hanging them, Michelle. I know it's a pain, but trust me, they help. But why do I..." "Just..." She paused as she got control of herself again. "Just keep hanging them. If you need more, I'll send you some. I know a guy out there who makes them, and he owes me a favor. I'll get you some in bulk, but please, just hang them. And stay safe." "Safe from what?" Michelle asked, getting frustrated. Her mother had never been this serious, and it scared her more than the video had. Her mother clearly knew something, but she wouldn't tell her. She had never been good at keeping secrets, and Michelle didn't understand why she wanted to start now. I gotta go. She seemed to gather her thoughts as she tried to find a way to explain. "Just keep hanging them, and stay safe. I love you, Michelle. I'll send you some dream catchers soon so you don't run out." Then she hung up on her, and Michelle was left confused and agitated. She thought about what her mother had told her for the rest of the night. The way she had acted scared Michelle, and the transition from her mother's nickname to her real name had made it all the more jarring. Her mother had started calling her Micah when she was a kid, thinking it sounded more earthy, and Michelle hadn't heard her use her real name in quite a while. She had started to hang a new dream catcher, but paused midway through trying to hook it up there. The more she thought about it, the more she saw no reason to hang a new one. She'd had bad dreams when she was younger, but it was something that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Who's to say that the dream catchers had done anything? She froze there, unsure whether to proceed, and finally, she just tossed the dream catcher onto the nightstand. She'd sleep without it tonight and see what happened. Worst case scenario, she had a bad dream that night and would wake up and put a new one up. It took some time to get to sleep, but Michelle was sure that tonight would be as fine as all the others before it. When she woke up midway through the night, she was glad. The dream she'd been having was terrifying, but it was nothing compared to what she had woken up to. Her dreams had been incredibly dark. She had woken up in a hellscape, the sky constantly burning as the rain came down in runners of flames. She was lying naked on the hard stone, her body pulled close as she shuddered. All around her there were creatures gathering, their growls like thunder. She closed her eyes, trying to wake up, but it just never seemed to happen. She was stuck, waiting for these creatures to come in on her, and as the first lunged at her, its bony mouth snapping, she came awake like a deep sea diver from the depths. She thought for a moment that she was still sleeping, until she felt the pressure in her ear. She had never felt anything so intimate, so violating, and the feeling made her shudder in utter terror. She swiveled her gaze to the left and saw something large and pale crouching beside the bed. It looked like a giant white bug, its body pale and wrinkled. It was hunkered below the side of the bed, like a kid wanting to ask a question. Its bald head gleamed in the moonlight, and Michelle realized that her window was open again. The long red tongue that slid over the edge of the bed and into her ear was as hard to miss as the pale horror kneeling there. The tongue bulged her eardrum, making her head feel far fuller than she was used to. It felt like it might be going all the way to her brain. What was he doing? Was he trying to eat her? What was going on? The tongue slid soupily out of her ear, as his piss-yellow eyes grew large. He had noticed that she was awake. As it reached its full height, Michelle realized how big it was. 7 feet tall, each arm tipped with 6 long claws. As it loomed over her, Michelle worried that it would finish what it had started. Its long tongue slid over its thin lips, and they turned up at the corners as it took her in. "Don't worry," it whispered, its voice high and waspish. "I need you alive so I can continue to feed. I must admit, it's nice to get a taste from the source again. I usually get your tasty floating snacks, but today I got a real treat from the old country." Its tongue slid over its lips again, its face a rapture as it remembered the flavor. It climbed out of her window, its body groaning as its bones leaned into the twists. But Michelle felt utterly paralyzed. She didn't understand what was going on. What in the world was that? Had that been what her mother had been trying to protect her from? Had she known about it? Why hadn't she just told her? Michelle pulled her knees to her chest, the terror sending shudders up her frame, and as the birds began to chirp and the sun sent pink fingers over the edge of her window, she finally reached for her phone. Her mother sounded sleepy when she picked up, but it sounded like she might have been expecting the call. "So, you saw it, then?" Michelle couldn't answer right away, managing only a small grunt of acknowledgement. "Did it hurt you? It never did when you were a kid, but you knew it would come after me then?" It wasn't a question. When you were young, you started having night terrors. You would wake me up every night with the most terrible screaming, and I didn't know what to do. Worse than that, you drew pictures of the dreams the next day. Flaming skies, terrible creatures, just the bleakest places imaginable. I didn't know what to do. One night I woke up before you started screaming and felt like I needed to go make sure you were okay. That was when I saw it. He was leaning down over you, his tongue coming out of your ear, and he seemed to be drinking something out of your head. He ran when he saw me, bending out of the window like a serpent, and that only deepened my confusion. That was when I tried the dream catchers. It was on a whim. I didn't know whether it would work, but when it stopped your night terrors, I thought that maybe it kept him away. When they started disappearing, I figured out what was going on." She stopped, collecting her thoughts, and Michelle could hear the sounds of crickets making music in the background. Wherever she was, it was someplace green. Michelle could almost see the trees and feel the breeze, and she suddenly wished that she was with her. Was this why Mom had traveled so much? Was she running from something too? Michelle suddenly realized how little she knew about her mother, and wished that she had taken the time to learn more. The dream catchers don't do anything besides what they're supposed to. They take your dreams and store them inside those strings. Whatever these things are, and I mean things because I don't believe there's just one of them. They like eating your nightmares. The dream catchers distract them, give them something to eat instead. That's why you need to keep hanging them. Michelle wanted to ask more, wanted to know if her mom had any idea about the places she saw in her dreams, but instead, she just reached for the dream catcher on her nightstand. I'll be in touch," Michelle whispered, hanging up as she stood on the bed to attach it to the ceiling. She wouldn't feel safe again until it was back in place. In truth, Michelle wondered if she'd ever feel safe again. My parents moved when I was a senior in high school. Not all at once, they moved in stages, and I was allowed to watch the house while they took their things a little at a time to their new house. This was great for me because I had a steady girlfriend and a group of friends who would regularly stay at the house with me. My parents had a huge house, and as long as I didn't wreck it, they didn't really care what I did. As long as I cut the grass and fed the dogs, they sent me money for groceries and let me carry on. It was a very interesting time in my life, and it lasted until I was nearly 20. By the time they were ready to move, my life had kind of fallen apart. My girlfriend had met someone at work, and I caught her cheating and told her that we were done. My friends either started college or started jobs and didn't really have time for hanging out at a friend's house who did nothing but watch his parents home. I saw less and less of them and had less and less company to speak of, so when my parents made me the offer to come with them, I did. There wasn't a lot for me to do in my old town, so I packed up and moved to this place they had been slowly transitioning into for the last 2 years. The house was actually a lot nicer than the one that they had moved out of. The old house had been big, but it was old and in disrepair. The yard was also pretty large and required a lot of mowing, even in the winter months, given where we lived. The new house was just as big, but had a stone fireplace and hardwood floors and a much smaller yard than the old house. My brother, a few years younger than me, enjoyed the new school, and my parents had moved into new jobs in the community. They told me that it would be much easier for me to start college here, but until then, I could get a job in town to supplement my income. It all sounded fine to me, so I settled into one of the upstairs rooms, and that was where I saw the ghost. Ghost might be too grand a term. It wasn't some spectacular phantasm or some dripping corpse moaning up the halls. It looked like one of the cheap ghosts from a low-budget movie, but it was certainly enough to scare the bejesus out of me. The first couple of nights I spent in the house, I was too tired to do much besides moving my things and falling into bed. The third night, however, was a little different. I had spent the third day in town looking for work and had figured that I was going to have a harder time finding work here than my parents. Unless I wanted to work in retail or fast food, I was going to need to look somewhere else, but that was fine with me. I'd seen on the television that there were a couple of hospitals the next town over, and they were always looking for someone to work in IT or at the switchboard. So that night, I fell into bed, but woke up a little after midnight to a strange sound in my room. My room was huge. It was 12 by 15, with a bed and a desk and a closet, but there was only one window, and it was facing out on the front yard. That time of night, the moon was coming in to light the section of floor where I had laid a rug and a coat rack, and that was where I saw it. At first I thought it might be one of the coats I had hung on the rack, but when it turned, I knew it was something a little different. It looked like a girl, about 15 or 16, made out of TV static. She was looking around, calling for her mother, and hadn't seemed to have noticed me at all. I lay in bed, full of fear and wondering just what the hell was going on, when she suddenly looked at the door, and her sorrow turned into fear. She started to shake, backing away from something, and before she disappeared, she screamed and vanished in a puff of static. It was the strangest thing that I'd ever seen, and as I laid there in bed, I think I convinced myself that I had just imagined it, or it was a dream. I had never had any trouble believing in the paranormal before, but this felt different somehow. This felt like a video or a projection, and I wasn't sure I really believed in it as something other than that. It was just a dream, some trick of the light, nothing more, and I rolled over as I faced the wall and tried to get back to sleep. The next night, however, I woke up around the same time with a tickling feeling on the back of my neck. I was facing the wall that night, sleeping pretty soundly, when all of a sudden it was like insects crawling across my skin. I slapped at my neck, and when I did not get the crunch of an insect, I turned over to check behind me. There she was again, the girl that I had seen the night before. She was standing in roughly the same place and mouthing fearfully at something that I couldn't see. She did this for a minute before turning our way and disappearing again. 2 nights in a row made it a little harder to push away as a dream or my imagination. I took my blanket and went to one of the other bedrooms upstairs, and thankfully I wasn't bothered by ghosts in any of them. I thought about just moving my stuff into one of the other rooms. My parents had said that I could have the old bunk room, but they hadn't said that I had to stay there. Still, I was curious now. This is some kind of mystery, and I really wanted to know how it ended. So the next day, when my mom got up to start cooking breakfast, she found me in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. "Mom, are there any ghosts in this house?" Mom laughed, and that immediately put me at ease. "No, sweetie. The house was only built 20 years ago, and no one has died in it in those 2 decades. Unless you're seeing some kind of ghosts from the land, there certainly aren't any in the house." Some of you may be skeptical, but if my mom said that there's no ghosts in the house, then I believe her. Mom is one of those ghost hunter fanatics. She watches the shows, she goes on ghost tours, and she generally believes in most of the spooky stuff that you see on TV. It's not just that she believes in Bigfoot and aliens, and I'm pretty sure that Mulder is her spirit animal. So, for her to tell me so distinctly that there were no ghosts made me think that I must have been wrong. I must have had a bad dream, like I thought. I decided to go back to the bunk room. It had the best light during the day and the best access to air conditioning, and went about my day as usual. I stayed up a little bit late that night, playing games with some people online and generally goofing off. So when I felt that tickle on the back of my neck again, I looked and saw the ghost girl standing not too far behind me. I nearly fell out of my chair, and some of the language I used probably would have made my parents pretty unhappy. She was still standing there, cringing and talking, but saying nothing. Then, after about 10 to 15 minutes, she disappeared, and I was in an empty room again. When Mom came downstairs that morning and found me at the table again, she laughed loud enough to make my dad ask if she was okay. "What's wrong, kid? Ghosts keeping you up again?" "Kinda," I told her, and I told her what had happened. She listened. Like I said, Mom was really into all the ghost hunting stuff, but after I finished, all she could do was shrug. "I don't know what to tell you. The realtors have to disclose if anyone died in the house, at least for the last 10 years, and I asked. You know me, I've always wanted to live in my own little haunted house, and the lady assured me that no one had died in the home, so no ghosts, though it wasn't for a lack of trying." I thought about that for a moment. Well, what happened to the previous owners of the house? Mom turned her back on me so that she could stir grits and seemed to contemplate how much to tell me. "Well, from what the realtor told us, the family that lived here before us built the house and another house in the valley below it. The down below is technically ours. We just don't know what we're going to do with it yet. There used to be a house down there, but it burned down before the family that built the house moved out." "But what happened to the family?" "She didn't say," Mom said, "but she did tell us that no one had died in the house that anyone was aware of." I thought about it, but realized that she had omitted something. "What about the house that used to be in the down below?" Mom was quiet, and then I guess she decided to stop being so cagey. The family that lived there died in the fire, and the fire was set under some pretty mysterious circumstances. I don't really want to talk about this first thing in the morning. It's kind of a sad topic to start the day with. I decided to let it go for now, but I also thought it might be time to do some research. I had the day off, no applications to put in or financial aid to seek, so I went to the library and decided to see if I could find any information about my parents' new home. There was a little bit in the local paper. It talked about the house fire that had killed the Maynard family, Mr. and Mrs. Maynard and their young daughter, but it didn't mention much else besides the fact that Mr. Maynard had a brother. The article didn't say too much about him, but I suppose that he could have been the one that built the house. There was nothing else in the paper about the incident or occurrences at my parents' house, so I decided it might be time to speak to the source. The small town my parents had moved to was little more than a 2-stoplight town, but they had a small paper that ran the local events and a small bit of local gossip. The town crier had an editor and 2 writers on staff, and when I asked who had done the story about the fire at the Maynard house, they directed me to a man with thick glasses and a tweed jacket. He looked more like an English professor than a column writer, and after shaking my hand and hearing what I was after, he looked like I had force-fed him a lemon. Yes, the Maynard fire was a tragedy, to be sure. Happened almost 10 years ago, and it was one of the first stories I covered. Did you have some questions about it or something? I told him my parents had bought the other house on the lot, and I was looking for information about the previous owners. He took his glasses off and wiped them, but it amounted to the same thing that my mother had told me. He was stalling, trying to figure out the best way to tell me something that he didn't want me to know, and trying to figure out how much of it to tell me so that I would go away. There was more than just a house fire here, and I was beginning to suspect that it was something the town didn't want to talk about. Let me give you a piece of advice. This is one sleeping dog you need to let lie. It happened a long time ago, and the people involved are just trying to get on with their lives. Leave it alone, for the good of those that are still alive. I thanked him for his time and his candor, but I think his warning just made me more interested. I decided to swing by the realty office to talk to the woman who had sold them the house, and they had a few more people than the paper. The realtor, Marjorie, was out, but I told them I'd wait, and after about 20 minutes, she came back and handed the receptionist some papers before the woman pointed me out. Marjorie smiled, but I got the feeling that she didn't really want to talk to me either. "You must be one of the new owners of the Maynard place. I hope everything is going well." I assured her that my parents were very happy with the house, but I was looking for a little more info on the place. I lied and told her that I'd found something written on the inside of a closet, and I was just curious about the previous owners. When she asked what I had found, I told her it was gibberish, and I was just wondering if someone was in the occult or something. No, not that I know of. The Maynards left about 6 months after the fire, but their daughter was normal enough from what I remember. So do they still live in town then? I'm sorry, that's not something I'm at liberty to talk about. Regardless, the Maynard family is fine, and I don't think you should bother them, if that's what you intend to do. They have suffered a lot after the fire, and they'd rather be left in peace. She seemed to realize that she had said too much after she finished, and excused herself, saying that she needed to get back to work. I left the realty company, feeling like I'd taken 1 step forward and 5 steps back. I had more questions than answers, but I was really wondering if I could get to the bottom of this. Ghost girls aside, this mystery had its hooks in me, and I felt like the town had a vested interest in keeping something a secret. I headed back to the library, trying to find the threads again, and that's when I remembered what the writer had said. He said the fire had happened about 10 years ago, and the realtor had said they moved out of the house less than a year later. If the Maynard kids had gone to school around here, maybe I could find something with those dates and years. It was vague, and it made me feel a little creepy, but it was all I had to run with. It took a while, and I think the librarian thought I was a weirdo, but I finally discovered something. A news article about a local fundraiser had made me feel cold as a picture of the students involved scuttled across. It was the 4-H Club's annual farm auction, something they did in the spring. Now, one of the smiling girls was hugging a lamb and looking into the camera with frozen joy. It was the same girl from my nightly haunting, and the name underneath gave me a name to go along with the face. Stacy Maynard, 15, poses with her prized winning lamb, Chumley. The realtor had let it slip that they lived in town, so a quick search of the yellow pages, and I discovered that she had been right. She was still in town, living in the Masterly Hedge Apartments. And after Googling the address, I worried over the idea of talking to her. Everyone else in town had turned me down cold when I kept up my questions, so who knew what this woman would say when I asked her? I tapped my pen as I looked at the address, finally deciding to give it a shot. What did I have to lose, right? She was out on her porch when I pulled up, the little patio off the side of the apartment, holding quite a few plants. She was watering them, her blonde hair sticking out the back of her baseball cap, and she looked up as I approached. She looked a lot like the girl from my room, the way a mother might look like their child, and I think she saw something on my face as she asked if she could help me. She looked like the realtor and the writer, polite, but apprehensive. I was hoping to talk to you about something. It's going to sound strange, but you've been haunting my house. She raised an eyebrow at me, laughing nervously. That's a new one, but it's still a pretty sloppy pickup line. No, I'm sorry, I'm making a mess of this. Did you used to live at 563 Sorora Street? That seemed to make her nervous. Yeah? Why? My family lives there now. I stay in the upstairs room, the one with the window facing the front of the house, and every night there's a ghost girl that looks a lot like you. She stays for a few minutes, she never says anything, and then she disappears. The longer I went on, the less impressed the woman looked. Uh-huh. Okay, well, I think it's time for you to go now. This is all very interesting, but I'm not really interested in whatever this is. She started to go back inside, and I tried my best to find something to prove I wasn't just being a creep. The girl looks like she's about 15, and she looks terrified. She keeps calling for her mother while she watches the door. She looks absolutely terrified. I just wanted to know why she was so scared. She had been halfway through the door, but she stopped, and she turned around to look at me. How do you know that? No one would be able to know that. I was by myself that night, but she shook her head, realizing what she had said. She stood there for a moment, contemplating what to do with this stranger that had wandered up all of a sudden, before finally deciding to invite me in. "Sit here on the porch," she said, as she headed inside. "I'm going to get tea. I feel like I need something stronger, and I'm out of everything but cooking sherry." I parked it on one of the plastic chairs that she had on the porch, and when she came back with a jug of tea and 2 glasses, I thanked her. "You aren't the first person to come to talk to me. What happened was a town secret, but there were definitely people who wanted the real story. I swore I'd never talk about it again, but it kind of feels like you're part of this, and that's not your fault. So I'm going to tell you what happened, and when I'm done, I don't want to talk about it again. Do you understand? After this, I don't want to talk about this ever again." I nodded, taking a sip of tea as she emptied her own glass and refilled it. "Okay, so my dad and my uncle got the land from my grandpa. They had shared it, and my uncle wanted to build his house in the valley, while Daddy wanted to put a house on the hill. They were co-owners in a moving company, and they were doing pretty well. They were close, thick as thieves, but they couldn't have been more different. My uncle was a loving man, affectionate and supportive, but Daddy was a monster. He made life hell for my sister and my mother, but especially for me. I was his oldest daughter, and I seemed to get the brunt of his anger. He beat us. He yelled at us. He did..." She closed her eyes and shook a little. "Other things to us, but we were all too scared to say anything to anyone. But that's not why you're here, though. But I guess it is, too. That moment you're talking about was one of the last times he hurt me. The time before someone did something about it." She looked at the tea glass, watching the ice cubes rattle around before continuing. "Daddy and my uncle were fighting a lot before he died. He found out that Daddy had been taking money from the business, and he wanted him to give it back. Daddy refused, but my uncle had threatened to turn him into the police or something. I heard only snippets of their fight, or fights over the phone, that I only got one part of. But one night, Daddy decided to do something about it. I remember waking up to see my uncle's house burning, but I think I knew he was already dead. Daddy had killed him, killed my aunt and my cousin too, and I think the town knew it too. They couldn't prove it. Daddy had covered his tracks, but they remembered when he was younger, and they knew he was a monster when he grew up to be a bigger monster. They had seen the bruises on my mother and on us, and they had seen the animals dumped in the gutter near his house sometimes, and they knew it couldn't go on much longer. Then one night, he gave them their reason. Mom was at work. I'd come home early from a 4-H event, and Daddy was waiting for me. He asked what I'd been doing, asked why I was out so late, and when I told him, he called me a liar and a lot of other things. He tried to put his hands on me, and I had a momentary lapse in sanity. Maybe not. Maybe I just had had enough of being beaten, but regardless, I pulled away and ran upstairs. I slammed the door, pushed the dresser in front of it, and just screamed for my mother. I was terrified of what I had done. I knew that when he got inside, he was going to really let me have it this time. He was going to beat me, and there was nothing I could do about it. I called out for my mom. I begged her to come home and save me, but when the door opened with a crash, I couldn't do anything but hunker against the wall and accept my punishment. It wasn't punishment, though. It was just violence. I think that was when I realized that he was never actually punishing me, never delivering anything for my own good, and I slipped into unconsciousness. That didn't stop him, though. I woke up in the hospital, my mom crying as she told me how sorry she was, promising that nothing like this would ever happen again. I found out later that she had come home to find me unconscious. My dad was downstairs watching TV like nothing had happened, while I lay in a puddle of blood and fought for my life. She called an ambulance, and the police had been called, and my daddy was arrested. They took him to jail, and he claimed that he had done nothing. They had no proof that he had beaten me, no more proof than they had that he had burned down my uncle's house and killed his family. But the people of the town were tired of suffering him. While I was in the hospital, a mob came to the house and took him away. I don't know what they did to him, and I don't want to know, but he never bothered us again. He'd killed his brother and gotten away with it, and he'd beaten his wife and children for years, and they had ignored it. But putting me in the hospital seemed to be their tipping point. So that's what happened. I don't know why you can see it, but that was the moment that caused it. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves and the potted plants whisper. And when I thanked her for the tea, I took my leave. To this day, I don't know why the girl appears in the room every night, but knowing what brought it on, I also don't much care. I've been back to visit Miss Maynard a few times since, and we've become pretty good friends. I also moved my stuff into the room across the hall, and I'm happy to report that no phantoms take up residence in there, at least not that I've found. I don't know if the wood in the room is so porous that it soaks up memories, or if what happened that night was so terrible that it made an impression, but the girl, to my knowledge, still appears around midnight before disappearing. I've slept sounder since I moved across the hall, and I have no intention of moving back. I opened the mailbox and started shifting the mail around to see what today's bunch of crap was. Bill, credit card offer. My hand froze as I looked at the envelope, my jaw quivering a little as I read the address on the front and the name of the sender. This hadn't happened in years, not since I'd left college, but I'd felt safe enough to settle somewhere, hoping that the letters had stopped. It had been 3 years since she'd written, but it made me feel like I was a teenager again, fearing that anyone but me would find those letters. From Catherine Mansley to Justin Mansley. Dear brother, it's been so long. You should come see me in the blue. Love, Catherine. I tore the letter up and went back inside, trying not to notice how the paper had made my fingers feel clammy and moist. The envelope, too, had been the same way, moist and difficult to hold. It was like wet paper that had dried badly, but it was always that way. When Catherine sent me letters, they were always like that. I had kept them at first, hiding them so no one would find them, but I burned them now, not wanting them anywhere near me. I picked up the phone to call Daniel, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried to call my uncle, but Uncle Mike was hoping I had seen Daniel. He said he'd been missing for a week now, and everyone was getting worried. I can hear him calling me now as I sit on the floor with my knees against my chest, trying not to hyperventilate. But I know it's useless. That feeling is the closest I can come to drowning, the closest I can come to understanding why Catherine writes these letters. Daniel, Carter, Clint, Henry, they're all gone now. I'm the last one that Catherine hasn't got. When we were kids, or early teens, we would all stay at Grandpa's cabin over the summer. Grandpa was long dead, Grandma too, but the cabin was always called such. My mom and Dad would usually come up first to get it ready, and I loved the time before my cousins got there, the times I could just enjoy the cabin. I haven't been back in years, not since we went back for Clint, but I can still remember the cabin. It was more of a lodge than a cabin, and Dad claimed that Grandpa's dad, our great-grandpa, had built it by hand. It was made from the huge old trees in the area, and it had a big area downstairs with 4 rooms above it. The rooms were easily as big as hotel rooms, the Motel 6 kind, and they held our family and the families of my cousins easily. Dad had a brother, Uncle Mike, and a sister, Aunt Claire, and both of them had 2 kids. Catherine was the only girl in the family, other than Aunt Claire, and the youngest. That meant she tried extra hard to keep up with her older cousins, and it often led her to trouble. The time she fell out of a tree and broke her arm, the time she'd bruised her legs and butt jumping her bike over a 15-foot drop, the time she'd nearly drowned at Carfer's Pond, were all times she was trying to keep up with us. We were merciless, too, giving her no quarter, and it must have been miserable for her. We loved to hike and swim and spend time in the cabin, but the thing we all looked forward to seeing the most when we came out here was the blue. The blue was a hole in the woods, more like a pit than anything, with water inside that was perfectly blue, like the stuff inside the jar where the barber keeps his combs. It went 30 feet into the earth, the precipice sheer and easy to stumble into if you weren't paying attention. The water inside was so blue that it hurt your eyes if you looked at it for too long, and it always looked artificial to me. Someone had hung a bridge over it, a rickety thing that swung across on ropes, and my cousins and I thought it was great fun to go and tempt fate by bouncing on it and making it sway. Thinking about that now makes me downright shudder, but all kids think they're immortal. I was 12 when it happened, but it could have happened before then easily. We'd been at the cabin a week, swimming and fishing and generally enjoying our time in the woods, when Clint said he wanted to go see the blue today. He said it quietly because if he had said it any louder, his mom or my mom would have heard, and that would have been the end of it. All the adults knew about the blue and had forbidden us to go anywhere near it. Dad had told us stories about playing on that bridge when he and Uncle Mike were kids, but Aunt Claire had always been too scared to go on that rickety old thing. I think my dad knew that we were going to go out to the blue, probably expected it, and never expressly forbid us to go there, unlike my mom. He knew that forbidding it would just make it more enticing, and if he let us get it out of our systems, the blue would become boring, all on its own. I don't think he believed something tragic would happen, but if he had, he might have kept a closer eye on us. We told our mothers we were going on a hike, Uncle Mike, Uncle Dale, and Dad having gone fishing that morning, and they said that was fine, but to be back by lunchtime. We made our way out as quietly as possible, thinking ourselves clever for not letting Catherine hear us, but no sooner had we jumped off the back porch than here she came with a "wait for me." Clint grumbled that we should just run off without her, but that was when my mom poked her head out and told us not to forget Kat. Catherine seemed pretty pleased with herself as she followed us out of the yard, and as we hiked towards the blue, she realized where we were going. "We can't go there," she said, looking scandalous. "Mommy said it was off limits." "Well, Mommy isn't here," said Daniel, "so if you don't want to come, then turn around and go back." Catherine seemed to think about it, but must have decided it was too far to walk back on her own. We were about 2 miles into the woods, and despite her desire to follow us everywhere, Catherine was kind of a scaredy cat. She didn't like being by herself, and it usually led to her getting hurt when she tried to follow us into dangerous situations. She still followed us, but suddenly she was a safe distance away as we made our way towards the blue. When the trees parted and the edges of the pit opened up, we knew we had arrived. "There it is," Clint breathed, the lip coming into view not long after. "So cool." We had seen it a dozen times, but it was always awe-inspiring. The hole was like something punched by a meteor, the edges jagged and uneven. Maybe there was a meteor at the bottom. Maybe it was what made the water so blue, but we had never seen it. Well, not yet. We were only really interested in the bridge that day and cared nothing for the natural beauty. We spent the first few minutes just leaning over the edge and spitting into the water below. We couldn't see when it hit, but we knew it had. If the side had crumbled, we'd have all gone in. Then this story might have been very different. "Let's go on the bridge," one of them said. I think it was Clint, but could have been any of them. It was definitely Carter who agreed, but we all wanted to go. The bridge was what we lived for, the thrill we came back for, and the second my hands touched the ropes of that swinging death trap, I felt the adrenaline begin to pump within me. The bridge was in disrepair from the first time we found it, and it had only gotten worse over the years. It was missing a few boards, the ropes frayed and peeling, and we should have known it was only a matter of time before there was a problem. When we got to the bridge, all of us crowding onto it as we usually did, Henry moved to the front and began swinging it from side to side. The ropes creaked as we all laughed and held on. Henry was quite a bit larger than most of us, and when he rocked the bridge, he really rocked the bridge. It swayed wide over the gap, and we all laughed and joked as we swayed along with it. We'd been cheating death for a couple of minutes when we realized that someone was missing. We looked back towards the lip of the pit and saw Catherine hunkered in the woods. She was miserable, not liking the sight of us trying to throw ourselves into the blue, and didn't seem to want any part of it. We joked and picked at her, but I wish now that I had seen the fear in her eyes and thought better of what we were doing. I should have been a better big brother on that day. "Come on, Cat," Clint said. "No way," Catherine said, grabbing one of the trees like we might try to pull her onto the bridge. "Don't be a scaredy cat," Clint sing-songed, repeating the phrase scaredy cat, again and again as the rest of us picked it up. I didn't pick it up till the last, but I chanted it right along with the rest of them. Catherine was clearly on the verge of tears, but she still had her pride. She stomped over to the bridge, as indignant as anyone could be at 6, but as she came to the edge, she started to look unsure again. Her hands shook as she reached for the ropes, and when Henry stepped out of the way, she walked hesitantly onto the rickety boards of the bridge. Henry closed off her retreat, and she stepped closer to our group as she tried her best not to cry. "All right, Henry, let's get some big swings in this time," Clint trumpeted. Henry seemed all too willing to oblige, and soon the bridge was rocking farther than I'd ever seen it rock before. It was swinging over the blue like a pendulum, and even I was afraid that we might go in. It was pivoting back and forth, the ropes groaning like a ship's mast in a high wind, and I wondered for a moment what it would be like to fall into that blue water. You could only really tread water for so long before you went under, and I wondered how long that would be.
Would anyone get back with help before you drowned? I didn't see when Catherine fell off the bridge, but when Henry yelled out a moment later, I looked over and saw her when she hit the blue. She didn't splash, the water just stayed put, and she came up thrashing as she tried to get her head above the crystal blue water. The water must have been thick because she was really struggling to make headway in it. She was calling for help with big, gasping breaths. The bridge had stopped moving, all 5 of us looking down into the chasm and knowing that we were in trouble. We'd been playing where we shouldn't. We had been being stupid, and now someone had gotten hurt. "We've got to go get help," Daniel yelled, and his words were like a starter pistol. I ran for the cabin to try to get help, Daniel and Carter coming with me. I prayed Catherine could tread water while we ran the 20 or so minutes back to the cabin, but I knew that Catherine wasn't a strong swimmer. I didn't expect she would still be treading water by the time we got back, but I prayed to God that she would be. Mom, Aunt Claire, and Aunt Liz were at the table when we ran in, drinking tea and laughing, but they jumped up when we told them what had happened. Mom came running when she heard, grabbing a rope and running along behind us as we went back. My dad and uncles still weren't back from fishing, but Aunt Liz said that she would call emergency services to hopefully get someone down there. The run back took a little longer, all of us winded from the sprint to the cabin, but Catherine had only been in the water for 45 minutes by the time we got back. That wasn't so long, I thought. She could be fine. It turned out it was 45 minutes too long, though. Clint said that she'd gone under about 5 minutes after we'd left, and she hadn't come back up. My mom tied the rope off to a tree, but it was too short to make it down into the blue. She went back for another rope, my aunt staying with us, and by the time she got back, she had emergency services in tow. They brought long ropes and divers, and soon they were in the blue, trying to find her. The diver who went in said the blue was miles deep, and the water was like trying to swim in jello. They went as deep as they dared, but they never found Catherine. My dad and uncles came back from fishing to find my mother inconsolable, and Catherine presumed dead. They didn't have the heart to punish us for what had happened, and all of us said it had been a terrible accident. We left out the part where we'd been rocking the bridge, and they decided that Catherine must have lost her balance and fallen in. They shouted a little that they had told us to stay away from the blue, but they could see how shaken up we were by what had happened. They thought we had been punished enough, but it appeared that something else disagreed. We never went back to Grandpa's cabin again. It held bad memories for the 3 of us, and I don't think any of Dad's siblings went back either. None of my cousins went there willingly again. It held terrible memories for all of us, it seemed, and I think they knew something dark was waiting for us to come back. The first letter showed up 2 weeks after Catherine's funeral. The 2 weeks after we buried my sister were a really bad time for me. I was sad about what had happened to Catherine, but I was also unbelievably riddled with guilt over it. I felt that I had every right to be guilty. I'd played a part in what had happened, but I didn't think I'd been the biggest part. Looking back, my cousins were really the ones that had pushed her to get on the bridge, but I hadn't stood up and tried to protect her either. I'd failed in my duties as a big brother, and she had paid the price. My parents had been talking about back-to-school shopping, something they seemed unwilling to do, and my mother was trying to guilt my father into getting it done. They were both distraught over the loss of Catherine, but my mother had always been a bit of a realist when it came to things. My sister was dead, but I would still have to go to school whether I wanted to or not, and I would need things to begin school with. While they were arguing about it, Mom told me to go get the mail, see if the circular had come in. I think she wanted coupons out of it, but I can't really remember. I would find it hard to remember much about that day when I looked back, except for the letter. I went to the mailbox and found that there was a circular in there. There were also 2 bills, a couple of condolence cards, and a letter in a strange envelope. The envelope felt moist,
the paper seeming damp and moldy, and I didn't like to touch it. I started to sandwich it between the condolence cards, and that's when I noticed it had my name on it. From Catherine to Justin Mansley. I felt the other pieces of mail slip from my fingers when I read the name. It couldn't be. Catherine was dead, dragged into the blue by whatever lay below, and there was no way that this letter could be from her. I thought it might be a trick, maybe one of my cousins, but they had all seemed as guilty about what happened to Catherine as I was. Clint hid it behind a constant stream of humor, but he still clearly felt like he needed to hide what he'd done. Like me, he realized that he could get in trouble if they knew that he'd been goofing around, and I didn't think he'd be stupid enough to try to pull something like this. I opened the strange envelope. I didn't want to. I wanted to throw it away, but I had to know what was inside. Even at 12, I knew there was no way it could be from Catherine. Dead people didn't send letters to the living, but I still had to know what was going on. The letter was brief. All of Catherine's letters have been brief. It's your fault. You should be the one in the blue. I just stood there for a moment, looking at the letter. I started to rip it up, thinking again that this was a cruel joke, but something stopped me. It isn't something I can really explain, but tearing that paper felt like tearing pages out of the Bible. It felt fundamentally wrong, and I ended up stuffing it in my pocket instead, as I collected up the mail that I had dropped on the pavement. I couldn't destroy it, but I didn't want my parents to find it either. What would they say if they saw it? Would they know what I'd done? I couldn't risk that. I was in enough turmoil over my sister's death without my parents blaming me for it. I came in and dropped off the mail, sneaking up to my room as I hid the letter in a box of baseball cards under my bed. It wouldn't be the only one soon enough. Over the next 2 months, I got 2 more letters, each on the same day of the month. After the second one, coming about 2 weeks after school started, I started checking the mail every day to make sure the letters didn't get picked up by my parents. I hid them in the same box, each of them reading similar to the one before it. I'm lonely. I miss you. It's your fault. Come to the blue. Come to the blue. Come to the blue. It was October, the leaves already a vibrant orange in the front yard, when Clint called me after I received my 3rd letter. "Are you doing this?" he asked, sounding angry and scared. Sounded like he was shaking something in the background, paper or something, and I asked what he was talking about. "These letters. Carter and I have each gotten 3. If this is you, then you need to stop. We all feel bad about what happened to Catherine, me especially, but this is going to get us in trouble. If one of our parents found those letters, then we could be in serious trouble for what we did. Your sister is gone, man. I'm sorry for it, but this isn't going to bring her back." I knew what he was talking about without having to be told. I told him I'd been receiving them too, and I bet Henry and Daniel had been getting them as well. I still didn't think they were from Catherine. There was no way for dead people to write you letters, but somebody clearly knew what we had done in the woods. Clint said that was impossible. We had been the only ones in the woods that day, or at least the only ones around the blue when Catherine had fallen in. He said it had to be one of us, and before he hung up, he was going to call Daniel to see if he was the one playing bad jokes. He called me back 20 minutes later and said they were just as freaked out as he was. He says he's been dreaming about the blue, and he knows that Henry has too. Henry's talking about the blue a lot these days, and Daniel is scared he's going to tell somebody what really happened. I hadn't thought of that either, but I suppose by then I thought it might be what we deserved. The letters kept coming on the same day of every month, and I realized that it was the same day that Catherine had gone into the blue. We all received our letters on the anniversary of her fall, and as Christmas came around, We all started to worry about Henry. Henry had always been a big boy, looking like a high schooler, even though he was only a year younger than Daniel. But when he came to our house for Christmas, he looked like he'd lost 30 pounds. It also looked like he might be pulling out his hair. He was twitchy, quiet, nothing like the boisterous boy we had seen a few months ago. Daniel told us that when he talked, it was about the blue. He said he dreamed about it, drew pictures of it, and in the pictures, Catherine was floating in it. Henry and Clint had been the last ones to see her alive in all that blue, but in the pictures, she was waving at them from the water. He says in his dreams, she comes out of the blue and tries to get him to jump in. She told him that it's nice down there, it's cool and wonderful, that he would really enjoy it if he were to come join her. He keeps talking about joining her, but I don't know how he would. Dad told Mom that we were never going back to that cabin, not after what happened. They're all really afraid that one of us will fall off that bridge if we went back, Daniel told us as we sat around the kids' table in the den. Henry sat at the table with us, but he did little more than move his fork around in his mashed potatoes, not really eating anything. A couple of months later, my aunt and uncle put Henry in a psychiatric facility. Dad told us he was sick, but Daniel said he'd started having night terrors, and he almost completely stopped eating. He couldn't go to school. He wouldn't play. It was like he just shut down completely. Daniel was afraid to sleep in the same room with him, and he really hoped that whatever this place was they had taken Henry to, that they could fix him. A month after that, Henry broke out of that facility and was never seen again. No one was quite sure how he had gotten out without being seen, but Henry was gone. Everything in the room was exactly the way it had been the night before, including the restraints that were still buckled in the same way they had been when the orderly put him to bed. The police thought for sure that they would find him walking along the road or something, maybe in the woods around the place, but they never did. Uncle Mike and Aunt Liz were devastated, but the four of us were pretty sure we knew where Henry was. They'd never find him, just like they never found Catherine. We were all pretty sure he was in the blue. The facility they put him in was about 30 miles from Grandpa's cabin, but we were still certain that that's where he was. When I got my letter that month, all my questions were answered. Henry came to join me in the blue. You should come and see him. He's much better now. Daniel and Clint called me later that day, and I told them I'd gotten the same news. What are we going to do? Clint asked. I didn't have an answer. Carter went next, though it took him 2 years to do it. Carter was about 2 years younger than Clint, the youngest of the cousins besides Catherine, and he held out only because he and Clint were so close. I don't think Clint's parents ever had any inkling of what was going on with their son, but by Thanksgiving, he was looking the same way Henry had. He was barely eating, and only then because Clint coaxed him. Clint had changed a lot since that summer when we lost Catherine. He had softened a little, and I think he had realized that life was a little more fleeting than he had believed. He said Carter wasn't sleeping, was having nightmares about the blue, and told Clint that Henry was in the dreams too now. Carter was smarter than the rest of us, not that that was saying much, but I think it helped him put off the bad feelings and get through it for a while. Unlike Henry, Carter just looked tired all the time, and when he came to my 14th birthday party that year, the bags under his eyes looked like bruises. It's not as bad as it looks, he told me with a faint smile. My parents sent me to a doctor to get some meds that help. Well, not really help, but they let me sleep. They make it harder to get out of the dreams, though. I asked him about the dreams, and despite Clint telling me not to make him think about them, Carter said he didn't mind. Daniel and I sat close, like students listening to a lecture, and Carter reeled a bit as he thought about them, not seeming sure how to begin. I'm standing on the bridge. It's nighttime, It's always nighttime in the dreams, and I'm looking down into the blue. It's... He blinked really fast for a few seconds and shook his head before going on. It's glowing in the dreams. It's always glowing. As I stand and look down, Catherine and Henry come up out of the water and wave at me. They tell me to jump. They tell me to join them. They tell me how great it is down there. As they tell me, I kinda wanna jump. His eyes shut for a count of 5 before he jerks awake with a start. I want to go to them. There's no dreams in the blue, no nightmares or letters or anything. It's just peaceful. He leaned over onto Clint and started snoring, and Clint accepted his weight gratefully. Carter nearly made it to my 15th birthday party, and a lot of that was due to Clint. This whole thing brought us all closer together, and we called each other often. Daniel actually came to live with us for a while, his parents having trouble coping with Henry's disappearance. Aunt Liz was eventually put into the same facility that Henry had escaped from after she tried to overdose on sleeping pills, and Uncle Mike soon moved in with us too. He and Daniel looked sad most of the time, but I think they enjoyed having us close. Daniel had started having the dreams a lot more often, but he was 15 and starting high school, and he had other things to occupy his mind. If there was anyone who could have used our help, it was Clint. Clint had started high school too. He and Daniel were a year older than me, but he missed a lot of days while he tried to take care of Carter. Carter was losing his mind at an alarming rate, and Clint confided that he had started strapping him into bed at night. I caught him sleepwalking to the front door, and he fights me when I try to get him back to bed. I don't know how my mom and dad haven't noticed yet, but I may have to tell them soon. He's like a zombie, and I don't know how he makes it through school every day. A week before my 15th birthday, Aunt Claire called to tell us that Carter and Clint had gone missing. They both disappeared in the middle of the night, she said tearfully. I just don't know what to do. The police have no idea, but I'm hoping that maybe they'd gone to your house for some reason and they were safe. My mom said they hadn't, but she and Dad said they would help her look for them. Clint's bike is gone too. I told Dale that Indian Scout was a bad idea, but he swore Clint was responsible and that he wouldn't just up and leave without telling us. Daniel and I were eavesdropping, and he said we both knew where he'd gone. After my parents left to join the search party, we piled into Daniel's Jeep and went to Grandpa's cabin, as little as we wanted to. Uncle Mike had left him the Jeep when he got his driver's license, but this would be the longest trip we had ever made in it. Grandpa's cabin was about 2 hours from my house, and despite having left a note, I was sure my mother would be worried sick. The drive seemed to take forever, and when we pulled up in front of the cabin, we found Clint's motorcycle out front, and we knew what we would find. It was dark when we got to the blue, and Clint was kneeling on the ground as if praying. The dirt beneath his forehead had turned to mud, and he didn't even look up when we approached. I didn't catch him in time, he said through tears. I didn't wake up until the sun was nearly up. By then it was too late. He beat me here by minutes. I don't know how. I tried to catch him, but he was already standing on the edge when I got here. I begged him to come back, but he just pitched over and went into the blue. He was right, he said, pointing. It glows at night. I hadn't even noticed, but as I looked up, I could see it now. The blue was glowing like the iridescent moss you sometimes found in caves. And as I looked down, I thought I saw 3 people swimming down there. They were looking up at me, but I leaned away before they could entice me over. Clint, Daniel said. Clint, we need to go. Go? Clint asked, not seeming sure what he was talking about. Yeah, we need to go. It's too late for Carter, but your mother's worried sick about you. Aunt Claire thinks you and your brother have been kidnapped. Maybe even that the same people got you who got Henry. Let's go back. Let's go back before something happens. Something already happened, Clint said,
his voice husky. "Carter's gone, Henry's gone, and I'm tired of living with these dreams every night. They aren't going to stop until we all go in, and I'm tired of fighting it." "What are you?" Daniel started, but Clint had stood up and sprinted for the lip of the drop before we could stop him. Daniel made a grab for him, but missed completely. We both stepped after him, trying to catch him, but he was over the edge before we could even process what was happening. He didn't splash when he went in, just like Catherine hadn't, and Daniel and I stood there breathing heavily as we watched the still surface of the blue. When he didn't surface, we walked back to the cabin with only the moon to guide us and called our parents. Emergency services came in to dive in the blue again, but Daniel and I just sat there in shock. We've got to get some distance from this," Daniel said. "Maybe if we go where she can't find us, the dreams will stop and we can avoid the same fate as the others did." I asked him if he believed that, and all he could say was it was worth a shot. They sold the cabin after that. My Aunt Claire and Uncle Dale had lost both their kids in one night, and they took it pretty hard. Daniel and I helped each other through the next few years, but when Daniel graduated and said he was taking a job overseas, I could tell that the dreams were starting to get to him. I'd kept my grades up, using the sleepless nights to study, and was eligible for early graduation. I'd been accepted into a college 3 states away, something that broke my mother's heart. Daniel wished me luck. For the next 3 years, we just kind of maintained. The dreams got better with distance, and soon I stopped having them altogether. Daniel told me the same and built a life for himself in South America. After 3 years, I almost forgot about the dreams and the blue, just chalking it up to something remembered wrong from childhood. And as I got closer and closer to graduation, I couldn't wait to start my new life. Then Aunt Liz died, and Uncle Mike had begged Daniel to come back. Aunt Liz had died of a stroke in her bed, having left the facility years ago. And Uncle Mike was a mess. He had never really gotten over the loss of Henry, and he begged Daniel to come back and help him. Daniel had agreed to come back and help with the funeral preparations, but then he said he had to go back. He invited Uncle Mike to come back with him, saying he could stay with him in South America, but he doubted that he would. "It's only for a couple of weeks, a month tops. I'll be fine," he assured me. Now, he was gone too. As I sit on the floor typing this out, I can hear something I haven't in 3 years. The blue is calling again. Catherine is calling again. I don't know how long I can hold out. Sooner or later, I'll go join the rest of them. Sooner or later, I'll return to the blue. The old guilt is still there. It's always been there. I was a fool to think I could run from it. I should have saved myself the trouble and jumped in the night Clint went in. Now, I'm the last. It's only a matter of time before Catherine gets me, too.
It was all my fault. It had almost cost Felicia and I our lives. Our friend Sandy was having a house party, and we both wanted to go. Sandy threw the best parties, and they usually got pretty wild. The last one had been a real blowout, and we both had a little more than foggy memories from it. Sandy was celebrating her graduation from nursing school, so we all knew this one was going to be a serious rager before she had to settle in to pay student loans. Before we went, Felicia and I agreed that one of us needed to stay sober so we could get home safely. "We don't want a repeat of last time," Felicia reminded me, and I nodded as I remembered how the Uber driver had tried to hold us captive until we agreed to invite him in. Running in heels is never fun, but we had managed it that night and beat him to the door of our apartment. So, we did rock, paper, scissors for it. Went 10 out of 10, and I ended up with the loss. I wasn't happy about it, but I decided that I would do my best to stay sober, so we could get home without having to A, get rides from creepy handsy guys, B, get murdered by a stranger, or C, have to take a cab that neither of us could afford. We pulled up to the party already in full swing, and I took a deep breath as I prepared to say no to temptation and be the best sober friend I could be. I lasted all of an hour before I just couldn't hold out anymore. Someone handed me a drink, didn't even ask, and I drank it before I could think better of it. It was one of the very tasty screwdrivers that were going around, so I decided then and there that this would be my only one. I could still hold out. One drink wasn't going to get me. An hour after that, I was completely plastered. Felicia was not pleased when she found me. She had decided to go all in, so now both of us were drunk and had no clue how we were going to get home. We took one look at each other, laughed, and said screw it. We drank way more than we should have that night and had a blast. We danced, we drank, and we mingled our way through the party. And when Sandy waved us out around 2 a.m., we were basically holding each other up. I staggered to the car, but I couldn't even get my key in the door to unlock it, let alone drive. Felicia and I decided that we would just walk home. It was 7 blocks from Sandy's house, but we had no chance of getting a cab this late, and the Ubers would be all weirdos at this point. Felicia agreed, but was basically dead weight after 3 steps. She was ready to sleep and certainly wasn't interested in walking 7 blocks. I was holding her up, looking for options as my own buzz wavered, when I saw a yellow cab parked at the corner. I got excited. It was a little late for cabs, but I wasn't about to question Providence. The light was still on, the guy in the front seat looking pretty awake, and I thought our luck might be turning around as we staggered towards him. I knocked on the window, and the guy with the red hair snugged down under a driving cap jumped as he turned to look at me. He was a big guy, big with fat instead of muscle, and he looked surprised but also delighted as he rolled the window down. He asked how he could help us, and I told him we needed a lift. He asked where we were going, and after telling him the address, I offered to give him a nice big tip if he got us there safely, with no weirdness. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I can manage that," he said with a big smile. "Hop in." So we piled in the back, he turned off his light, and off we went. Felicia was asleep about the time we made the first turn, but I decided to stay awake to make sure the driver didn't try any funny business. We were from a pretty big city, and girls had been going missing pretty regularly lately. You read about it on Facebook all the time. They go out, get a little drunk, and then they're never seen again. No one really knew what it was, but a lot of people thought it was a murderer. It was scary to think about, but I felt a little safer being in a real cab rather than an Uber with some random guy. You never quite knew what the vetting process was on Uber, but I knew the cab companies had to do background checks on their drivers, so at least this fellow was on the up and up. "You ladies coming from a club?" he asked, making small talk as he took his first left. "A house party," I said, trying to be polite. "Our friend was throwing a real heck of a get-together, and we partied a little too hard, I think." "Sounds like fun. Looks like your friend had a little too much, though." "Yeah, she does that sometimes. I was supposed to stay sober so I could drive us home, but I'm not very good at it." "Well, I guess it's a good thing for me, then." I made a non-committal noise and settled back. There was a little holder on the partition with waters in it, and when I reached for one, I saw the cabbie turn to track my movements. He seemed interested in what I was doing, and I held up one of the waters and said one of his fares must have left it behind. It was a shame because my stomach was a little too full of alcohol, and some water would have been really nice. "Oh, those are for my fares. I have a bunch in the cooler in here. I replaced them as needed. Help yourself." I thanked him, testing the seal to make sure that it was still sealed. It seemed to be, but I never got it open.
The feel of the wheels beneath me was lulling me to sleep, and I was losing the fight. I tried to stay awake, but I was just too drunk. My eyes kept slipping shut and opening, and as I threatened to go under for good, I heard the cabbie's phone ring. He picked it up, talking to someone, and it was like his whole demeanor changed. There was a very different voice than I was used to. Gone was the jovial guy who had picked us up, and now he was gruff and kind of short with whoever he was talking to. It seemed like a complete flip in personality. "Yeah, I got him. We'll be there soon." I started to ask what he meant by that, but before I could question the statement, I was unconscious. I don't know how long we were out for, but I woke up suddenly, unsure of where we were. I looked around, groggy and disoriented. Felicia was still sleeping beside me, dead to the world and not showing any signs of coming back, and the cabbie was still behind the wheel and driving us home. At least, I thought he was. I glanced out the window, no longer seeing tall buildings and concrete, and I thought he must have taken a wrong turn. We were in the country. The buildings traded for rural pavement and shadowy houses. Everything was dark outside, no streetlights this far out in the country, and I just watched it whiz by for a moment as I tried to make sense of it. I was confused, not sure how we had gotten so lost. Then I remembered the conversation before we passed out. "Yeah, I got him. We'll see you soon." Even in my drink-addled brain, I remembered those words. I glanced at the numbers on the dashboard clock and was surprised to see that we had been in the cab for over an hour. It shouldn't have taken that long to get home. 7 blocks would have been an easy drive this late at night. And as I tried to sit up, I felt something press against my wrist. The unopened water was a cool pressure against my arm. I didn't remember opening it and realized I must have fallen asleep before I could drink it. My vision swam as I tried to come upright, and I blinked quickly to clear it. "Where?" I tried, but my throat was dry. "Where are we?" The cabbie jumped a little, probably figuring I'd passed out like my friend, and when he looked over his shoulder, I heard again the voice of that happy cabbie who had picked us up again. "We're driving to your home." I tried to make his words make sense, but it was like wading through mush. "This isn't right. I live in the city." "You told me 175 Worth Street," he said, tapping his phone in the holder on the dash. "No," I slurred, trying to make my head stop spinning. "It was 751 Worthy Street. We were..." I put a hand to my mouth as hot vomit threatened to come coursing up. "We were only 7 blocks from our house." He put a theatrical hand to his brow. "Oh my gosh, I guess I put the address in wrong. Let me just find a place to turn around and we'll get you back on track." He started tapping at his phone, but I could see he wasn't hitting anything. I was suddenly wary, some of my intoxication ebbing away as he put on a show of trying to get the address right. I remembered those stories about the girls that had gone missing, and I wondered if our names and faces would be on the news tomorrow. Would they think we just wandered off after drinking too much? Would they even look for us? He turned down a side road, saying he was going to turn around, but instead of turning around, he kept driving. I banged feebly at the glass that separated us, telling him he was going the wrong way, but I was so weak. I felt very dehydrated, my mouth dry and my head spinning. I reached for the water, but I thought better of it. I didn't want anything he might give us, and as the top came off, I squeezed it against the little holes that allowed us to hear him. He jumped and cursed, turning around to glower at me as the voice from the phone came back again. "You stupid bitch! I hope you keep that energy when they get you. They'll teach you some manners."
My blood ran cold at that, and I let the empty water bottle fall as I looked for other options. I tried the doors, but the child locks were on, and I couldn't get it open. I started to panic. I kicked at the door, at the glass, but each kick was more feeble than the last. I was starting to feel like I might pass out. The cabbie laughed, telling me about all the terrible things the people he was taking me to would do, and my vision was swimming with tears. I bent over and puked in the floorboard, some of my wooziness clearing up as I purged the liquor, but it also left me feeling weak and unsteady. I banged my head against the glass as we finally came to a halt, and I went shakily to the window to see where we were. We were not miraculously in front of my apartment, the whole thing a dream or a hallucination, but in a vacant lot down some country back road. At the end of the vacant lot, perched like a gargoyle, was a white van waiting for us to arrive. As we sat idling, the doors came open and shadowy figures started getting out. I felt my blood run cold as they walked towards us, stopping halfway between as if waiting for the cabbie. I thought again about my car sitting in front of Sandy's house, and how I could have driven us home if I had just stayed sober.
"Looks like we've reached your destination," said the cabbie, turning around to flash me a big creepy grin as he slid his seatbelt off. "Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back." And he hopped out to go talk to them. I shook Felicia, trying to wake her up, but she was little more than dead weight. They would get her. They would get me in my current weakened condition. I couldn't fight them off. I could barely keep my head up, and I cried bitter tears in the back of that cab. If I was lucky, maybe they'd just kill us, but I doubted it. We were both likely to end up in some overseas brothel or on the streets of South America, and either prospect was grim. The cabbie shook hands with one of the shadow people, pointing back at the cab and likely telling them he had a couple of half-drunk girls ready for transport. We were in the middle of nowhere. There was no chance anyone was coming to help us. We'd be heading wherever in no time, gone and forgotten, never to be seen again, and there was nothing we could do about it. It appeared, however, that someone had other ideas. They had started walking towards the cab when lights suddenly lit up the back glass. Cars suddenly began pulling up, vans and undercover cars, and people came out then with guns drawn. The men in the headlights of the cab put their hands up, and as they were surrounded and cuffed, they were dragged off to those vans pretty quickly. They took the men away, and that was when they seemed to realize that they had people in the back of the cab. They helped us get somewhere safe so they could get us checked out, and I'm pretty sure Felicia never woke up through the whole thing. They kept assuring us that we were okay, that we were safe, but all I could do was cry. I felt like I had been plucked from the brink at the last minute, and I thanked them with every breath I had. That was how I was almost trafficked by some gang or organization or another. The cops told us the less we knew, the better, and I agreed. I haven't drank since then, and now I'm a permanent designated driver for our group. I take friends of friends home too, sometimes intoxicated women we've met that night, just to make sure that no one goes through what we went through. So be wary if you see a strange cabbie waiting while you're wandering home one night. You may be in for a longer trip than you bargained for.